Good morning and welcome. My name is Gemma Dunn and I have the immense pleasure of being the Executive Director of ECVO, the Edmonton Chamber of Voluntary Organisations, and I'm so happy that you could all join us here to explore future trends in fundraising. This important piece of research was commissioned and stewarded by ECVO, BCG Biggs and the United Way of the Capital Region. But before we begin, I'd like to start this morning's event formally recognising that we're hosting this event on Treaty 6 territory. And whilst we're meeting virtually, during this time more than ever, we've been reminded of the importance of the land as we have visited rivers, lakes, forests, fields, mountains to find connection. These lands are the traditional meeting grounds, gathering place and travelling route to the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene and Nakota Sioux. We also acknowledge all the many First Nations, Métis and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for many millennia. As a first generation settler on these lands, it's important for me to acknowledge the privileges afforded to those who, like myself, are given opportunities to plant roots here, to resettle our families for the purpose of providing a healthy and happy life for our loved ones. Not all people have been given the same opportunities to thrive, and we cannot lose sight of the damaging effects of colonialism and systemic racism throughout Canada's past and present. As Dr. Laura Murray, a professor at Queen's University, asserts, we all have responsibilities to the treaties, to take them out, shake them out and reconsider them. This does not have to be construed as punitive obligation. Construing ourselves as treaty people holds the promise to reclaim, humanise and activate relationships that have become locked in unjust and dysfunctional bureaucratic state processes. I am truly committed to the truth and authentically exploring the role of ECVO in the journey from truth to reconciliation. A small action that ECVO has taken is to make membership to ECVO free for all Indigenous organisations, whilst we continue to explore what it means as an organisation for us to authentically be in this space. So with that, I welcome you all here today. As I mentioned in my opening comments, this work would not have been possible without our partners. And I am just so lucky that as the Executive Director of the ECVO, that most of my work really evolves around working with partners. And so it's with great pleasure that I'm going to invite Liz O'Neill, the Executive Director of Big Brothers Big Sisters Boys and Girls Clubs, to share why this piece of research was important from her perspective. Over to you, Liz.
Thanks, Gemma, so very much, and welcome everyone. Thanks for taking this time to be with us. And Celeste and Patty, thanks for the work you did on this project. You know, Gemma said we're also privileged that we get to work with partners, and we could not have had better people to work with than our colleagues at ECVO and our colleagues at United Way. And what I think is different about this report is generally one organization from one perspective goes out and takes a look at the landscape in terms of what's happening out there, what's changing out there, what new knowledge is out there, and what might we have to begin to think about going forth. And this time we did a little bit differently in that United Way has a major role in our community in raising money, and many of us benefit from their hard work in doing that. ECVO has a job in transferring knowledge, building capacity with not-for-profit and charitable organizations in our community. And we're a direct service organization. And somehow Celeste and Patty managed to do a major piece of work for the three organizations, giving us all what we needed. And so Gemma, for you to put together today's session so that our colleagues can learn how this work and what this work is telling us about going forth. Everyone do keep in mind that, you know, if you want to hear about it from a little bit of a different place, call your United Way folks. If you want to hear about it from a different place in terms of capacity building, call Gemma and her team. And if you want to hear about it in terms of direct service, you can always call our agency. Our Denisha's on the call as well, and Denisha was our lead here at BGC Biggs. So Gemma, thanks for including me today.
Thanks, Liz. It's always a pleasure to work with you and all the great people we get to work with in this community. So I want to hand over to Trish from the United Way of Capital Region, and she's going to share just a couple of reflections on her perspective and the perspective of the United Way and why it was important for them to be involved in this work.
Thank you, Gemma. Very similar comments to Liz. A big thank you to Denisha for bringing this forward, this opportunity. We really appreciate the chance to collaborate on this project, and it was such a pleasure. The past 2 years have really been challenging and unique, and I think left us all kind of wondering where we go from here. KCI is at the top of their field, and working with Celeste and Patty and team was invaluable. And so this report really did shape, our focus for the year ahead and the coming years, and making sure that we're focused on the right places. It was invaluable for our cabinet in our work with them. And we are bringing our board through this as well. And I'm sure many of you are experiencing those same questions with your volunteer leadership group as well. So it's great to see so many of you here online and taking advantage of this opportunity. I think you'll be thoroughly impressed with the report that KCI has put forward for our region and where we should be focusing. So thank you for the opportunity to collaborate with you all on this. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks, Trish. Every day I'm thankful for the amazing community leaders that we have in Edmonton, and even more thankful that we get to benefit from their wisdom and grace. So I just want to take a moment to really thank Liz and Trish and Denisha for their leadership in bringing this piece of research, this important piece of research forward for the benefit of the whole sector. So as many of you may know, ECVO has been on a journey over the past couple of years to understand how we might evolve, adapt and transform our practices as a sector to meet the needs of the communities we serve. The Future of Fundraising study really highlighted a couple of things for us to consider as we move forward. So some of the real takeaways for me were, as we think about engaging donors in events, good doesn't necessarily mean high end. That really hit home for me as we think about what does good mean. And we must be better in the space of storytelling. We keep talking about this, but storytelling and being able to tell us our stories as organisations, as a sector, is so important. But I don't want to spoil the presentation we have planned, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Celeste Bannon Waterman from KCI, who was our lead researcher on this piece of work. And it was a pleasure to work with you, Celeste, Patty, and the whole team over at KCI. For those of you who don't know Celeste, Celeste is an experienced development professional. She brings a diverse set of skills and expertise, as well as over 25 years experience in the nonprofit sector. With over 10 years working at KCI, Celeste has partnered with organisations of all scopes and sizes, from some of Canada's largest charities to small grassroots organisations developing fundraising capacity. Having founded KCI's research and analytics team, her work now encompasses a full range of strategic services, including fundraising, programme analysis, campaign studies, revenue generation plans, operational reviews, and targeted counsel. She also leads KCI's compensation benchmarking and consulting services, giving her a deep knowledge of success factors and characteristics of high-performing organisations. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand it over to you, Celeste. Thank you.
Thank you. I was just about to say thank you so much to Gemma, Liz, Trish, Denisha, and everyone who we partnered with on this project. It was one of the most fun projects that we've had to do in a while. Although, yes, you're correct, Liz, it was a bit challenging to try and look at it from all those different perspectives. We really valued that opportunity to stretch our thinking. Before I start talking, I do also want to thank my team again. Patty McIntosh, who's on the call today, was kind of my chief accomplice on a lot of these consultations and the report writing, but also on the team we had Evelina Piotrowska, who's not with us today, but is one of our research analysts and who helped with the writing of the report and providing a lot of the background research that you'll see in the report and that you're going to hear today. So with that, I'm going to bring up the presentation. Give me a moment just to bring it up here. This is a bit of a condensed version of what you'll see in the full PDF that I know Gemma has made available or will make available to folks in the ECVO if you want to see it. But today we're going to walk you through some of the highlights. First, I'm going to just talk a little bit, as you'll have heard, about the overview and the objective, which is really what we wanted to understand were some of these trends, as you heard. It's about the future of fundraising. So what's going on in the philanthropic environment, and with a particular focus for you in the Edmonton Metropolitan Region. And this is why one of the things that's so fantastic about our team at KCI, because we are across the country, we were able to leverage my perspective, but I'm in Ontario, there's a bit of a limitation there, although I do work with many organizations across the country, but it was fantastic that my colleague Patty McIntosh, who lives in Edmonton, was able to participate in this and really bring some of that local insight and flavor. So what you're going to hear about today as we go through this report is two key things. One, obviously, the fundraising tactics that we dug into, and some of the nuts and bolts that some of you are probably interested in hearing about what we think is working, what we think will work in the future, and what may or may not to the same degree. You're also going to hear about some of the broader sector trends that we see that are impacting philanthropy and charities and the nonprofit sector, just take it a bit more broadly overall, that aren't maybe specifically about fundraising, but that we think are really important for organizations to be thinking about for that strategic planning perspective that I think Trish touched on so well. And as just noted in the chat, yes, feel free to put your questions in the chat. I may or may not get to them as we go, but if we don't, we'll for sure get to them at the end and have a bit of a conversation section. So the methodology, what went into this report? A lot of things. We did some research and literature review, as you'll see in some of the findings. There were, of course, the discussions we had with our three partners who were exceedingly helpful in giving us that sense of what's going on in Edmonton and who should we be talking to really get that grassroots perspective. We did do many structured interviews with a range of stakeholders, including individual donors, representatives from key companies, foundation representatives, sector leaders, and some government representatives. We also did some focus groups, a variety of different groups, including probably some of you who may even be on the call, and huge thanks to everybody who shared their time and insights and knowledge to help us with this study. So here we go, some of the key fundraising trends. So you'll see throughout this presentation and the broader report that we sometimes pull back a little bit and say, what was going on before the pandemic and what are we seeing now as we come out of it here in early 2022. And some of the trends that we were seeing before the pandemic are really important because, first of all, they're continuing, they're not going away. And also, I think you probably have heard this, that the pandemic didn't necessarily change many things, but in some cases, it really accelerated trends that we were seeing before. Things that we knew were changing just kind of amped up throughout the course of this pandemic. And I think that's really important as we take that longer term perspective to think about what does it look like as we continue to move forward. And so some of the things that we were seeing before that continue to resonate, if not get stronger, first of all, we were talking about this concentration of wealth, and I think that has definitely continued. We know that there's this gap in income equality, and in particular, we're seeing that top 1% hold ever more of Canada's wealth. This is probably contributing to the second trend, which is this trend of fewer donors giving more. What we're seeing overall for all of Canada, and I'll show you the detailed numbers specifically for Alberta and Edmonton in a moment, but we're seeing this trend of fewer people, at least in terms of things like traditional tax receipted donations, fewer people saying that they made those donations each and every year, but the total dollars are going up, which means those few people are responsible for ever increasing portions of that charitable giving. Along with this, perhaps, is this trend around increased funds going to donor advised funds and or private foundations. So, I think there's a lot of discussion that we can have about that particular sort of giving vehicle where people maybe give large donations less often into particular funds or foundations that then do flow through to charitable organizations. But for sure, it's a trend that we're seeing. And it's interesting to me, I know kind of hot off the press, and after we wrote this report, the point around the increase in the disbursement quota that we saw come out in the budget just recently. It's not going to take effect yet. Of course, will take effect soon. Be interesting to see what that looks like and if it changes that trend at all, or if it's kind of old news in terms of what the funds look like for that sector. A few more trends that we saw when it came to individual giving. Women, the rise of women definitely when it comes to that wealth piece. We know women are controlling more wealth. And what's interesting is that they do tend to give differently. They tend to give more as a portion of their wealth. They also tend to be looking for things like impact and for their social contribution to be part of how they define themselves in terms of the legacy they want to leave. So really, important for organizations, as I'm sure you are, to be thinking about women, both in a very inclusive perspective, but to make sure that you are being women donor friendly, if I can put it that way. We also know that donors were already really thinking carefully about the types of causes that they gave to, and they're really thinking about themselves as cause-related donors as opposed to institutional donors. They're increasingly thinking about, you know, the sort of organization they want to belong to as a very collaborative perspective and wanting to be part of something that's larger than themselves. It's important to be thinking about what that means, because it means that whereas donors might have thought of themselves before as, you know, classically perhaps a United Way donor, now they may see themselves as a donor who's focused on a particular cause, whether that's, you know, poverty, homelessness, community services, whatever that looks like. And they may be less loyal to those particular institutions as they maybe shop around a bit more for organizations that they see are having an impact on that particular cause that they define themselves by. Finally, definitely been this increased focus on equity and inclusion. This was in place before the pandemic, and you're going to see it's resonated and grown even more during recent years. It's something donors are looking for more and more, is that emphasis on diversity and inclusion in all areas, whether it's the board, staff, or where an organization funds and how it interacts with the community. So I said that I would give a bit of a deeper dive on what that giving looks like in Edmonton. And this is what you're seeing here is, at the time we wrote the report, was the last 5 years for which charitable tax return data was available for individuals. It's the total amount in the graph. What you're seeing in the graph is the total amount claimed by individuals in the greater Edmonton region, or the Edmonton CMA, as StatsCan calls it, over those last 5 years. At that point, the last year was 2019. 2020 actually just came out this morning. So hot off the press, what I can tell you is it hasn't changed that much. What you're seeing in that in 2019, it was about 459 million in total. In 2020, it was about 460 million. Interesting in the sense the total dollars didn't go down. Also interesting, it didn't go up. You know, there's been a lot of conjecture, and I know a lot of impatience for those figures to come out. I was a little surprised, and I'll tell you what the surprises from my perspective were in a minute. But what I do think is interesting to note is that there's a lot of variability when we look at it over time, and often it has to do with those presence or absence, sometimes with those significant gifts. A couple other interesting stats about giving in Edmonton, Alberta, and Canada. What you're seeing here, I'm sorry, the legend for some reason has jumped into the middle of the graph, but the teal line is Edmonton, the red line is Alberta, and the orange line is Canada. On the left, you're seeing the percentage of those tax filers who said they made a donation in each of those years. And just like we saw for the national data, unfortunately, there's that kind of slow but steady decline. In Edmonton in 2019, it was 19.1%. of Canadians said they, or of residents in Edmonton said they made a donation in that year. As of this morning, the data we have for 2020 is it's even lower. It's now 18.4%, which is a substantive drop, even lower than the drop we saw for Canada as a whole, which is definitely a little bit concerning. On the right, you're seeing that average claim donation, which has been going up. And for Edmonton, just over $2,400 in 2019. In 2020, what we saw is that it was just a little bit higher at $2,463, so $50 more. So really some change in terms of total nation's average giving, but again, that consistent trend of fewer people saying they made those donations. This is what has surprised me, to be honest with you, is that consistent drop in the proportion of people who are donors. I really expected, based on many of the organizations we work with and a lot of the conversations we've had at KCI throughout the last couple of years, I really thought we might have seen a bit of a reversal in that donor number, whether it's percentage or even total numbers. And so I'm beginning to question, I've been musing on this all day, where are the donors going, or are we just missing them? And I think this is a really important question for us to be thinking about when we do see this data going forward, because what I'm finding is that most people do think of themselves as donors. I don't think 80% of the population has really disengaged from the charitable sector. I think we are missing these donations in some way, shape, or form. It may be that the tax system is not the best place to capture this data anymore, at least for, you know, most donors who give smaller amounts. Or it may be that, you know, donors are just not giving in the way that is meaningful and captured here. So we're going to talk a little bit throughout this report about some of the other ways that people support charities, including things like lotteries, events, crowdfunding, you know, small gifts that don't necessarily get receipts at all, let alone make their way to tax returns. So take this with a grain of salt, is kind of my conclusion on this. So during the pandemic, let's talk about that. What we heard about, and this is drawing really on some of those interviews and focus groups now that we conducted with particular donors. And we asked actually all people we interviewed about their personal giving, but whatever the reason or, you know, the particular connection that they were there for, because, you know, all individuals, as I said, see themselves as interacting with and supporting the charitable sector. And all of them also are very proud of the way that they support charities. And I think that's a really important piece to take away from this. Almost everyone we've talked to, and this is consistent with broader conversations we've had, people said they had at least maintained their donations. Now, I will say, remember that we are probably talking to a subset of the sector. We tended to be talking to people who were employed during the pandemic. We know that's not been the case for everyone. I think that's really important to remember. Probably talking to people who are relatively highly employed. So again, not the case for everybody, but within this group, definitely a sense of commitment, if not increasing their giving to the sector, and a recognition that they need to step up and give back. That being said, even this group really acknowledged that there were a lot of ways they used to participate and support charities that they just hadn't been able to in the same way. So they may have inadvertently reduced support. So they talked about not being able to participate in events, for example. They talked about their volunteering having been negatively impacted. And so, you know, while they might see themselves from their charitable budget maintaining giving, they probably are not giving the same amount overall when they really crunch the numbers. Where they really have been focusing, and I would say they've doubled down on this, is local organizations. Everyone is concerned about their local community and wanting to give back to that, you know, sphere of influence that they can really help. They also, what was interesting is that they were so impressed with how the charitable sector responded. And again, looking at the, you know, the interviews we did with people who were specifically in Edmonton, it's interesting how many of them were able to pull out specific examples of things they saw where the charitable sector responded. They really noted that charities stayed open, or at least did their best to keep their services going in whatever way they could. So, you know, donors saw you, is what I would say, those of you in the charitable sector, and they really appreciated it. They talked about a number of examples of collaborations too, where they saw, you know, charities choosing to work together maybe differently, perhaps in ways they had before, but they just hadn't noticed. They're perhaps paying a bit more attention during the pandemic, but they really noted things where they saw organizations pulling together. And so there's some examples here and in the report around things like the United Way, BGC Bigs, and the food bank coming together to deliver food hampers. They also, you know, noted that there were other organizations that were hard hit, but they tried to come together in things like hosting a 50-50, you know, ticket in the case of some of those arts organizations. A lot of great examples that people talked about. They also were impressed by innovation and the way some individuals or organizations tried to try new things, you know, launch new programs to help the community during this period. Not all of these were actually newly established during the pandemic, but I think it's worth noting that they scaled up, where they, you know, became, you know, more prevalent or continued to grow during the pandemic. And people saw this as real examples of the charitable sector trying new things and trying to be responsive to needs as they are in the ground. So again, just some more great examples of things that donors saw and recognized. Talking about individuals so far, so I just want to talk a little bit about corporations, because of course businesses are key supporters of the charitable sector, and they were a set of interviews that we did dig into and want to double down with. Before the pandemic, what we heard from companies and what we saw in terms of our research in the sector is that we'd already been seeing quite a bit of a shift in the way companies choose to give. And what I'm going to say here is that this does tend to be larger companies. So small businesses often tend to still, give small gifts, give by request, and really think of themselves as good corporate citizens. But what we tend to see is, especially with larger organizations, that they were evolving and they were really working to embed, I would say, their social benefit as part of their overall organization. So at one point that took the form of companies really partnering with particular charities as opposed to, responding to a wide range of inquiries and requests. So, classic example here is if you think of Home Depot partnering with Habitat for Humanity, that sort of brand alignment that we might have seen. And then it shifted, as we've all seen, to companies really starting to position themselves as agents of social change in terms of what they do and how they do it. Classic example here, Bell Let's Talk, right? Which is now an initiative with Bell that isn't necessarily tied to any one charity, and it's more about their own branding. Another example here that's very similar is the way Airbnb, and we're seeing it right now with Ukrainian refugees, of course. They started doing this a number of years ago, positioning themselves almost as an entity that offers social services, but they're still a company, although they know they have a charitable arm. But still, the point is, it's the corporate brand that's really wearing this. The other thing that we saw is that companies were increasingly all about employee engagement as part of their charitable giving. So in some ways, the audience, if you can think of it that way, for their social support may be their customers. Increasingly, they're also focusing on their employees as the audience for their engagement. Because employees, we know, are increasingly wanting to work with or be aligned with organizations that really, understand and respect their values. During the pandemic, we saw that really continue. So, that connection between corporate giving and employee engagement, if anything, I would say was stronger, another one of those trends that we really saw accelerate. And so companies were being very careful to show support for communities that their employees cared about. Again, local continues to be really important. So whenever you're thinking about companies and who might be interested in supporting you, as much as possible, that geographic alignment continues to be important, especially geographic alignment of where their employees reside, not just their consumers. We saw that growing focus on social issues. Corporate funders, what we know, have seen some of the challenges, and they, really are working, I would say, to respond and re-envision how they fund in response to that. And then what's also interesting is that those companies that are, I would say, maybe a little bit farther along the curve and more evolved in terms of the way they do their community investment funding have begun to understand the limitations of that model and, see that, their own personal grants or, funding may not have the impact that they really want to achieve. They're also looking at collaboration, whether that is partnering with other companies or government to kind of bring players together and generate more impact, which I think is an interesting trend to watch. Just a couple other points around corporate giving as we're seeing it now. As I'm sure many of you experienced, during the early part of the pandemic, companies that did have funding programs tended to loosen the strings or, in fact, increase flexibility dramatically to try and respond to the needs in the sector. They really pivoted and, opened up as much as possible to try and help charities pivot as well and respond to the crisis. But what we're seeing now is that there's that shift back. We're going to talk about this a little bit further on to programs and bringing back some of those restrictions and focus on, targeted objectives that I think is going to continue for a little while. We may see that there continues to be a bit more flexibility, but it's not going to be like it was in 2020. And there's just an example here about FCOR that we thought was a really great illustration of a lot of those trends in terms of, some of that flexibility around seed funding and that emphasis on partnership and collaboration. So one of the things that we asked donors through our consultations was what was important to them about where they gave. So in other words, what helped them decide not just which charities to support, but how much to give. And what they told us probably not surprisingly, is that the single most important factor is the impact on the cause. Charitable reputation is also important. What's less important, perhaps, is some of the, maybe the housekeeping issues, like whether it's convenient, the percentage of the donation that went directly to the cause. Was least important, what they said for us, was being thanked and recognized. Now, what I'm going to say is take that with a bit of a grain of salt, because we do know that donors, they don't tend to say it's important to be thanked, but they do feel it's important, that it is still very important to have best-in-class stewardship with donors. What was also interesting is that when we talked to those donors again about what charities they really were supporting at the end of the day, it tended to be the ones that they were already supporting, like we referenced earlier. They really doubled down on organizations that they had that connection with. And if I could say, that they maybe already understood what that impact would be, it helped them with that line of sight. So fundraising channels, so how people give is what we're talking about here, or maybe another way to think about it is how we ask people to give. We talked to donors a fair bit about this, and we've got a few kind of slides on this and some commentary on different channels. But what's really important, the key takeaway for me here, is that donors consistently said they give in the ways that they're asked. In other words, they really don't see it as them choosing which channels to, direct their funds through. They see it as them responding to how we, as the charitable sector, ask them. And it's interesting because there's studies from before the pandemic too, like particular StatsCan's regular survey on giving, volunteering, and participating. In 2018, they asked, how donors tend to give, and there's a nice little graph in the full report that you'll see. Most common method that donors say they give through is shopping center, followed by place of worship. And one of the things that we've kind of, really unpacked as we look at that data is it's highly doubtful to me that people are selectively choosing to give when they go shopping. It's just that they're being asked, and they're asked so often that that is the most common way in which they give. That being said, what people definitely told us is that no matter how they're asked, they do like convenience of giving online. And so that, I think, is going to continue. They will respond to asks in a variety of ways, and they probably will continue to respond when we ask them at places like, the checkout counter. But in general, they like giving online. So just something to remember is, as much as possible, engage in lots of channels, but remember that that's where they really want to give, especially larger dollars. The other thing they told us is, and this came through in a few different ways, is that just like in anything else, when it comes to charitable giving, there's fads, there's trends. People have fun with things like the ice bucket challenge or whatever that, particular thing is, but they also caution that these trends will come and go. And so, in general, it's important to stay aware and on top of trends, but it's also important to be cautious about how much you commit to them and how much you expect from those sorts of, trendy channels in future. One of the things that's definitely not going away, as you'll have seen by those previous donor stats and that trend of fewer donors giving more, is major giving. And so we'd be remiss if we didn't, dig into this. This data you're seeing here is based on our own research at KCI, where we try to track as best we can all publicly announced gifts of 100,000 plus. This is taking a particular look at what I would call the real mega gifts, which is the 500,000 plus, just because it's easier for us to make sure we've got a good handle on those. To be honest, they're more likely to be publicly announced and hit our radar screen. What's interesting when you look at it, the teal bar is the count of gifts at that level by year. And then the little orange diamonds and the call-out boxes at the top are the value of those gifts. What we saw is that there'd been kind of this, general upwards trend in terms of number of gifts at the 500,000 plus level, with actually increase in 2020 and 2021. The total amount given, however, did drop in those years. So what you're seeing is a mere 1.1 billion in 2020 and closer to 1.2 billion in 2021 coming from those gifts of 500,000 plus. It is lower than what we saw in the 3 previous years. but it's still substantively higher than what we saw prior to that. So even during the pandemic, where we know we saw a decrease in the really huge gifts, there was still a lot of money being given away in those six-figure gifts. Obviously, although it's not necessarily relevant or within the reach of all organizations, having that strong focus on people who can give larger gifts. I mean, we're looking at 500,000 plus, but I think the same is true if we were to bring this down to the $25,000 and $50,000 level, that they are becoming an increasing importance to the sector and overall where a lot of the money is coming from, however it's kind of flowing through. Planned giving, also increasingly important. Obviously, there's an aging population in Canada. You don't need me to tell you that. But along with that, we know that the planned giving market is growing for a number of reasons. It was growing already prior to the pandemic, according to a study that was done by GoodWorks. And this is really where we see a lot of Canadians able to make that substantial impact through their wills that they might not necessarily make when they're alive. And what's interesting, as you may recall, is that, during really 2020 in particular, we saw a lot of people taking their estate planning much more seriously than they had before and getting involved in will making. We also saw a lot of those people, at least according to a lot of financial planners and lawyers, we understand that many of them made legacy gifts through that process. I know it's 2022 now and that kind of wave has come and gone, but this is not going to go away. And many of those people who either did make wills or will be thinking about this in the next little while, important to be continuing to have that conversation. And we're not going to get into it in detail here, but I would encourage anyone who's thinking about that to maybe have a look at some of the willpower presentations or documentation that the Canadian Association of Gift Planners has been putting out recently. It's got some really great data and guidance for charities around that space. Events. Okay, so events have always been part of the fundraising landscape, and we know that there are often ways that smaller charities can really get involved in fundraising to start and begin to attract supporters and engage with their donors. That being said, we all know, like love them or hate them, we all know that they require a lot of resources to be successful. So it was interesting to see what happened to events during the pandemic. We saw a lot of organizations pivot to online. I'm sure many of you did the same sort of thing, and we saw donors respond. And I would say, kind of gamely, try to play along in some cases with events that were, they were as good as could be, but definitely not as good as we know they used to be when we were in person. So what's interesting is what people told us about what they see for events going forward. And here's what we heard overall. There's probably going to be less participation, at least for a while. Donors said they're looking forward to going back to events, but that they're also enjoying not being so busy, if I can put it that way. And there's a sense that they're going to be a lot more selective about what they do choose to attend. They're really rethinking the way they spend their time and enjoying perhaps being a bit more focused on some other things. That being said, anything that's about the fitness community, we've been told that's coming right back. If you were more about, the 10K run than you were maybe about the charity fundraising piece, there's a lot of demand for that. We think that's going to bounce right back. But things that are a little bit more casual or participative, so, think casual walks, fun runs, that sort of thing, may not have the same mileage going forward. But overall, to the point I think Liz made earlier, good events are what people are really going to be looking for. And good events doesn't necessarily mean high-end and glitzy. What people told us they're looking for are events that are mission aligned. That means it makes sense based on what you particularly do that you're having this event. They want it to be engaging and they want to be with other people who want to come together in support of that cause. Lotteries and gaming. So you can't not talk about this because it was tremendous how during the pandemic, lotteries became almost a lifeline for many organizations, and donors really responded to this. What we saw is a lot of people kind of got behind the fun aspect of a lot of charity lotteries and enjoyed that kind of sense of community. Again, in line with those other trends, that sense of belonging to something. Going forward, what we heard is that it may look a little bit different. And so just some key points around this is those who do a lot of lottery work, and these are people who are experts in this particular space and have been for a long time. They told us that it's important to remember that individuals think of their contributions to gaming and lotteries, even when it's to charities, differently. They tend to think of it from their entertainment budget rather than their philanthropic budget. And that aligns with the conversation I had earlier, where people said they kept giving, but maybe not, doing some of the other fun things. The other thing that we heard is that the market is probably saturated. So especially when it comes to things like home lotteries or those really, big and impactful ones, many people said that they expect any, new entrants into that space are going to be really challenged. At least initially, it would take time to build up that same degree of support base. And it would be hard to raise the same degree of return that you might see others getting who have already kind of been there and built up that strong brand recognition. Overall, we're expecting that revenue in lotteries and gaming is going to see some contractions. And it's partly because of that entertainment budget piece that we think as more options come online for people to spend their entertainment dollars, that this is going to contract somewhat. That being said, still really important. And I think there is still some space for some particular types of success in this area. Smaller communities, for sure. We're still seeing this resonate quite well. For example, a small community hospital foundation, they seem to be really succeeding with lotteries still. And I would advise, if you're in that space, don't stop. Gaming experts also talked about some new gaming options that may be coming online, like progressive or stage gaming. And, as we can get back to doing things in person, there may be, just renewed interest in things like home lotteries. We'll see. Crowdfunding. So I touched on crowdfunding earlier when we talked about, the tax receipted versus not donations. And crowdfunding is interesting. Arguably, people have been giving to other people for a long time. It's just that with technology, it's made it easier and more noticeable, and also the larger ones can really reach out to ever broader communities than they might have before. Interestingly, continues to be very popular, however, for younger people, with 3 and 4 people in their 20s and 30s, as you can see there, saying they prefer to give directly to individuals. Bit of a trend there that we're going to see pop up again later in this report. What's interesting too is the sorts of causes that crowdfunding tends to support. When it comes to charities, as opposed to directly supporting individuals, we know that social justice charities tend to do very well, or perhaps tend to employ crowdfunding a little bit more than other types of charities. Whichever, we know that that is definitely a strong alignment. We also know that people who support crowdfunding aren't necessarily completely different from people who support charities through more traditional means. There's a high degree of overlap here. So it's important to remember that they're not, black and white. The other thing that's really important to remember is that when you do look at crowdfunding, aside from some of those really big notable examples, the Humboldt Broncos, used to be the classic example. What we do know is most of the money tends to be within smaller communities. So whether it's people giving to people, it often tends to be, friends of friends, or that kind of direct connection. The same is true for charities. Successful crowdfunding often relies on that community that helps spread the word and gets others involved in your cause. There aren't many people out there who are just surfing the internet looking for causes to support. It's because they hear about it through that word of mouth, just like, has always been the case. So those are the fundraising trends. I want to talk a little bit about some of the broader trends supporting or impacting the sector. And one of the things we dug into, as you will have seen in the methodology, is we did have some conversations with key government representatives to get a sense of what they saw around what support of the sector would look like going forward. Specifically, one of the things they talked about is this kind of push-pull, if you will. They know that there's this, what they call power imbalance, because, to be blunt, the government tends to have the funds, on the one hand, that supports many charities, but on the other hand, many in government understand that for some aspects of their mandate, especially when it comes to things like health and social services, they're quite reliant on the charitable sector to achieve what it is they need to do. So it's a bit of a, interesting relationship, as many of you know intimately. But from the government perspective, what they really see is that it drives them to have this almost laser-like or, uber focus on impact and outcomes, because, they are trying to accomplish their goals. One interviewer says there told us that it feels like no matter what, she's too far away from the results, which drives a bit of that hunger around understanding impact, understanding metrics, being restrictive in designating funds, because she's just really trying to make sure that she can get that connection to impact. It also, one of the things they told us because of that is that that's what drives a lot of interest in multi-agency collaboration. They see the value in piggybacking to really try and, on the one hand, diversify those funds so that they, can have greater odds of success, if I can put it that way. But also to support that system-focused approach where they see that the funds are more likely to drive success in achieving those results that they crave. One of the other big trends impacting the sector, and again, true before, accelerating now, is transition and some of the concern around staff and leadership. So we talked about this from a couple different angles. One is, the idea of a leadership gap, which was a question that had been raised in a few conversations. And really, when we talk to people, within the sector or donors or, other sector leaders, what they told us is that they don't really see that there's a leadership gap or perhaps a turnover crisis in the sector quite so much as there are some underlying systemic issues that impact our ability to attract and retain workers and leaders. In particular, this difference in wages and working conditions came up quite a few times as something that contributes to the overall gap in talent. Also, in line with that, the lower resources tends to mean that we don't have as many resources to develop staff, both at the kind of all levels, but in particular that focus on real leadership development and training. There's also a bit of an understanding that younger generations aren't necessarily wanting the same things, or that they're quite as willing to accept perhaps what some of our current workers and leaders have in the past. There's a bit of a hunger for equity. I think younger people aren't quite as patient perhaps with some of the, the operating on a shoestring or, the lower wages that others might have been in the past. And it's not unhealthy, it's just something to be aware of as we move forward. Definitely, the Great Resignation is impacting not just the charitable sector, but everywhere, but it particularly hurts some of our organizations that can't necessarily pay the same degree of wages as we're fighting for fewer people. It feels like all the time right now. Also interesting is that while we were talking about staff in this, a lot of people brought up volunteers here, and they talked about the concern around an overall reduction in volunteers in general, but in particular, reduction in volunteers who can make the commitment, time, energy, as well as having the skill sets that we need for board members. Bit of an interesting, perspective that we've often relied on those types of volunteers, especially for smaller organizations. Board members are so critically important, not just to provide leadership and strategy, but in many cases, like just frankly, grassroots work. There's a lot of conversations that we're going to have to adapt our expectations and models going forward to make sure that we don't continue to rely on an ever shrinking pool of volunteers and frankly burn them out too. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. We talked about this a little bit before. Donors increasingly are looking for this. And again, this is another one that has really accelerated, not because of the pandemic per se, but during the pandemic, we saw, the concerns around George Floyd and other issues throughout North America. People began to understand how the pandemic had a really uneven impact on different, parts of our society. Really, social inequality has come into focus in a way that it never has before. And as a result, donors are really looking for organizations to respond to this in terms of, like I said before, board and staff diversity, but also where we're funding and how we're engaging with communities. It's interesting to see that even gifts to organizations that might not have been, traditionally seen as, promoting social justice, even gifts to them, like the one on the left there that was going towards a university, has this strong focus on supporting students from equity deserving groups. And whereas there's even, many donors just stepping right up and making sure that they are supporting Black organizations, Indigenous organizations, women-led organizations, whatever that looks like for them, we're seeing a real, interest and focus in that. One of the other big trends that I touched on before, and I said I'd come back to, is this, this trend of unrestricted versus restricted, or designated versus undesignated, however you look at it. We saw really an opening of funders and donors in response to undesignated requests. They gave, and they gave to just kind of core operating, gave without strings attached. There's been a lot of question around to what degree is that going to swing back. And as I mentioned earlier, we were talking about corporations. We do believe it is going to swing back. There's a definite trend, and we're seeing it more and more kind of every week now, around returning to, restrictions, programs, strings attached, if you can put it that way. What's interesting here is that the younger donors we spoke to tended to want to see more restrictions around their donations. This wasn't quite the way they phrased it, but they were often talking about wanting contributions to go directly to the cause, wanting to see that line of sight to impact, and not wanting to see their not wanting to see their donations go to overhead, which is an interesting trend to me, and I think will be important to watch for the sector. But overall, what it really speaks to me is that while we might have thought over the last couple of years that we had that conversation, that donors were understanding why we needed more unrestricted funding, we really need to continue to have that conversation. We need to really speak to the importance of organizational capacity, resilience, and that need for unrestricted funding so that we can make sure that we are internally strong to support those programs that people see on the exterior. Finally, storytelling. As touched on earlier in the introductions, storytelling is critical. What people really told us and what we heard, in not so many words, is they really want to hear these stories. It's how we, communicate who we are as a people and what it is that we're trying to accomplish. It's also how we understand, where we're having some success and where we're not, is these stories of people who are either positively impacted or need our support. So what it means for organizations is that in order to be able to really meet this expectation around storytelling, we need to have media and social media skills. We cannot look at this as optional. This has to be core to what we do to make sure that we are telling our stories that are appropriate and that are impactful and meaningful and exciting to donors and to other types of funders. It has to be integrated into our grant writing in terms of everything we do, not just those quantitative pieces. Those qualitative insights that provide that color to those figures are critical. And when it comes to impact reporting, in other words, telling people what we've accomplished with the funds they gave us, donors like personal stories here. What they really like is again, those qualitative stories that provide some insight and elaboration on the numbers and the metrics. So it's important to remember this is not just stories instead of metrics. This is as well as, but that are aligned and supporting. In conclusion, just to give you some final thoughts around where we landed after we did all this research and worked, and we tried to step back and think about what can help organizations as they look forward to the future. 3 key things. First, this has, as I said before, forced changes that were underway or needed to be made anyways. Don't turn back is what we would emphasize to you. Whatever kind of painful change you went through or you're feeling like you have to do, it is a good and positive driving force. You need to keep moving forward. We are not going to be able to go back exactly to the way things were before, as much as we might all want to, return to normal. The other thing we know is that what worked was human connections. This in all kind of the thread that weaves through all the pieces we heard and all this, particular research that we see. People want to feel connected to each other and they want to help people. So what we know is that you need to continue to put relationships at the center of everything you do. Continue to talk about that and focus on those donor relationships. It's about people, not transactions. And so you may find, there's some transactional approaches, and when we say that, we mean things like, whether it's sales, that's obviously a very dramatic example, but any sort of approach that is more about the metrics and the money as opposed to, the human connections, they may work in the short term, but they're not likely to sustain. It is about building long-term relationships with supporters who can be engaged in your mission that is the root of long-term success. The final thing I want to leave you with is that one interviewer said this to me, and it really resonated and came through in many other interviews. Not in the exact quite same way, but we really think this is very true, that 2022 is going to dictate what the future of fundraising will be. What that means, and what that person really meant by that, is that you almost can't look at 2020 and 2021. Those were transition years, is the way to think of them. This is the year that is most likely to set the pattern for the future. So what that means is that this year, be strong, own your space, but be nimble and ready to pivot. This is the year we have to see what works. We have to try a lot of things. We kind of have to see what of that spaghetti that we throw at the wall, what sticks and what doesn't, and then be prepared to reinforce that in years forward and to let go whatever doesn't work. So with that, I'm going to turn to my final acknowledgement page. And I think in addition to all the thank yous you've heard throughout the session, we really want to thank everyone in Edmonton. Donors in Edmonton who supported you and all the other organizations were fantastic. And we know that we wouldn't have gotten through without each other. On that note, I'm going to stop sharing and open up for questions. I see there, I think we might have one in the chat. Nope.
Thanks, Celeste. Yeah, we have one in the chat. This is from Jeff. Have any others on this presentation come across the new government regulations for unions to give to not-for-profits? It seems like it will create a big barrier for these unions to give to any charity moving forward.
That's a good question. I actually haven't come across that myself. Has anyone else?
We have not.
I think I saw some hands raised. Little Warriors?
Jeff Nechtel here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Jeff, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I'm from the Mental Health Foundation of Alberta here. I'm the Director of Philanthropy. So recently I was dealing with a donor of ours in the past that is a union donor and very strong supporter. And apparently there's a bill that's been passed. It's going to take effect in August. It's going to become so challenging for them to donate to not-for-profits that I really believe we need to get ahead of it, because I've yet to figure out a way to, it's very restrictive in the sense that the union can't get, unless they get complete agreement with every union member, they can no longer just collect money and then give on behalf to charities like ourselves or yours. So it's a real bill that goes into effect that the government has passed, and I forget what the bill is called, but I definitely think it's something where it doesn't really make sense why they're doing it, because it's not broken, but it's real. And so in effect, yeah, it almost sounds like they need literally 100% vote from every single union member to give to Big Brothers. And unless that happens, then they can't. And I don't know about you, but I'm sure in a union environment, not everybody's going to agree on one single charity. So it just becomes, and sort of the new tracking and things that are going to go with it, she literally said, we have to really rethink whether or not we can even do this anymore, or it's just logistically going to be a nightmare for us. So sorry, I over chatted, but I think it's definitely a big risk moving forward. And yeah, I was curious to see if anybody else heard about it, which I think somebody did.
Yeah, we have a comment in the chat that it's Bill 32. So I've not heard of this one, but I will commit to looking into it and seeing whether we can do any sense making on behalf of charities and nonprofits and what that might look like. So I do commit to doing that if that's of any help at all, Jeff.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think it would help all of us just have clarity, and maybe it's just coaching the unions on how it's going to work. So maybe it's not as cumbersome as they think. I really haven't seen it. I don't really. Yeah. So maybe that through the research, we'll be able to say, oh, no, you can do it this way. And it's not that big of an emergency, because they really were kind of displaced because they would be giving to us this year, but have to hold off.
Yeah, so I'll take this on from ECVO, and I will definitely get back to you and everybody else on this call with what I'm able to decipher from that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks. So we have a question from Blaine Blackburn, Celeste. Well, two questions. Could you comment on an assumption that these findings could be applied to Calgary with a degree of reliability?
Totally. Pretty much everything I think would apply to Calgary as well, Blaine, except some of the specific examples, obviously, and the Edmonton giving data. But the Calgary giving data is not that dissimilar in terms of some of those trends. And everything else is probably applicable, not just to Calgary, but across the country.
Thank you. And his second question, or the second question is, we're exploring a number of tactics as we form 2022-2023 strategy. Could you comment on the effectiveness of CIBS and blockchain, both locally if possible, but also nationally?
Sure. I'm not sure what, I think it's SIBS. I'm actually not sure what that is in blockchain. Are you talking about cryptocurrency, Blaine?
Yeah. Thanks, Celeste. So cryptocurrency, and then I think there's some other technologies like generally like different internet platforms, but we see it mostly in crypto. And then, excuse me, SIBS is social impact bonds.
Mm. Okay. So let me talk about crypto first, if I can, just because I got that in my brain. I think crypto, the way I'm seeing crypto right now, to be honest with you, is that I don't know that it's a particular strategy. I would see as, I think it's a channel, and a type of asset that you may want to receive. Your strategy is still primarily going to be about engaging with donors. It's just having an awareness that some of your donors are going to want to give through different vehicles. Just like some people want to give through stocks and bonds, some may want to give through their cryptocurrency assets. You'll definitely want to have, I think, soon we'll all want to be thinking about a strategy through which we can receive cryptocurrency when those gifts come. Because one of the things that we have seen to that point around fads is sometimes, lightning strikes on an organization and a community rallies around it for some reason and wants to give, and then sometimes that community is a community of cryptocurrency holders. Usually for most smaller organizations, this is not about being able to receive the cryptocurrency yourself. It's about having a relationship with someone that can facilitate that for you, whether that's a community foundation or another type of, officially receiving organization. Would strongly recommend having that worked out in advance, but I wouldn't recommend, a focus on cryptocurrency donors in and of itself as of yet. Focus on donors first, how they give second. What we're seeing is there's still a lot of volatility in cryptocurrency for sure. And the other piece I'd say too is don't gamble in cryptocurrency. Treat it like we used to, really diligently with stocks and bonds, and many of you still will. Receive it, sell it, and get the proceeds into your account. Don't try to engage, has been my advice on that for the most part. When it comes to social impact bonds and other types of social financing, there you have to really proceed with caution. It depends on what your return is and what you can offer. With My understanding of social impact bonds is that you do need to be able to achieve that return to pay the money back. And so there's some great examples of where this has worked. I've seen, for example, some cultural institutions where they receive maybe not a social impact bond, but another type of, charitable bond where they build something that then they can, make returns off. So for example, there's a museum that used a social bond to, maybe not social bond, a charitable bond, I'm, careful of my terms here, to build a cafe that they could, provide meals to people when they came to visit, and then they paid the loan back. And it worked really well, like it was a really great fund for them. But with social impact, you have to achieve that social return. And there you have to be careful about making sure that you can actually, follow through on that. It's, again, the same risks. There's a little bit around social enterprise in general in the full report. I didn't get into it in today's presentation because it's just such a big topic for 45 minutes. Again, it's about making sure that you have the business plan worked out on this and that you can see that line of sight to the return. Every situation is complicated. This is where your board can really be of help, especially if you have some business people on the board to give you that perspective on whether or not it works from a business case. It's not a panacea. I'm seeing a lot of kind of board members who don't understand what's really behind it and wanting to get on this. But when you follow it through, there's relatively limited applications that I see it works well. I hope that helps. Okay.
Thanks, Celeste. Appreciate it.
So I'm going to give another call out for any questions, any comments from anybody while we have Celeste on the call. So I'm just going to wait one moment while I see if anybody's got anything else for Celeste. Seeing and hearing nothing. Oh, there we go. Jeff has a comment. Go ahead, Jeff.
I just want to take the time to say thank you. This was really, really great data, like really well presented. And right at the beginning of the call, somebody said something, and I was recently on a frame webinar for a couple of days. And there's a gentleman from Britain that said, let's not, when it comes to not-for-profit, let's not make good the enemy of great. And I think that started as kind of the theme. Somebody talked about, like, we can't just be good, we need to be great. And so I thought it was the coolest quote, but I really appreciate all the time, like really great stuff. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff. So Celeste, so I've got a question in from Amy. Celeste made mention about social enterprise data, and I'm wondering where we can go to follow up on receiving that info.
Yeah, so not a lot of info, I will say, in terms of data, like to be specific, data. Social enterprise is, it's such a big varied field. And on, on the one hand, we've been doing it forever. Let's remember that here in the social service sector, we're not new to this. We've been doing, thrift shops and, auxiliaries and all kinds of ways to support our operations for a long time. But it is challenging sometimes to implement new models. There's a bit of commentary on that in the full report. And Gemma, the full report for ECVO members, how's that being shared?
Yeah, it's been shared with everybody that's on this call. It's on our website, and when we follow up with the evaluation, we will also attach the report and the recording of the session.
Yeah. What I would say is, if you're really interested in this, there are some sources in our report of things that we looked at to pull on. Those would probably be the best place to go and look. In particular, there's a couple older sources mentioned. I'm not going to try to quote them off the top of my head right now, but there's a couple older sources in that section that are still really good and really resonate, that have some great overviews of what social enterprise looks like and what some of the considerations are for charities. We just keep going back to because they're great sources. So have a look at those.
Thanks, Celeste. And I would just add to that, Amy, sort of reiterating what Celeste said, it's not new to us in this sector. However, we shouldn't be clinging onto it like it's a life raft as well, as government tries to devolve responsibility from itself to the sector for community outcomes. So we should be making really smart decisions about when to enter into a business enterprise, knowing that many new business enterprises fail within the first 3 years. And so if you don't have the support of your board and the support of good, solid financing to support your social enterprise in the early days, I would say that you would maybe transferring capacity from sort of your cause to this enterprise, and it may not be the best use of resources to do so. So I think tread lightly and be really considered when you think about social enterprises.
Yeah, agreed. There's some great caution from donors in our report around that exact point.
Okay, seeing nothing else, I just want to thank you, Celeste. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for the report. I want to thank our partners again, the United Way of the Capital Region, specifically Trish. And I also want to thank Liz and Denisha from BCG Bigs. Without this community leadership, we wouldn't have this fantastic report that not only serves our individual organisations, but also serves our sector at large. So I just want to thank you for your leadership that you show every day. I want to thank you and your team for the excellent work that you were able to do for us. And I want to thank you all, our community, for joining us today to hear a little bit more about the report. And as Liz said, feel free to reach out to any of us for more information on what this means more broadly for capacity building, or from a funder perspective, or from a direct service agency's perspective. And we will be following up with our very small evaluation. Like, it's really important for us to hear what you think about our sessions. And as I said, we will attach the recording of this session along with the report, just in case you don't have it. So thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.